Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look through Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Here's Eric Metaxas, best-selling author, has written for notable publications such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. Has a pretty famous and controversial article about how science increasingly makes a case for God. The link for that is on the slide here. You can look it up. Pause the video and take it down. So we continue part 1, and we look at chapter 2, where science cannot go, the Big Bang and other singularities. Scientists had several objections to the Big Bang, which were not unrelated. The first is that, like a heavy portcullis crashing down and closing off any possibilities of infinite time. Infinite time was the darling of many atheists who maintained that with enough time anything was possible and therefore the idea of God was unnecessary. Whenever anyone objected that certain things could not have happened randomly and without some designer or creator, those wed to the atheist materialist position would object that given enough time anything could happen. Life could arise randomly out of non-life in the primordial oceans. Amoebas could become redwoods. Aquatic creatures could become flying mammals. It was only a matter of having enough time, for time covered a multitude of sins. This creaky argument was wheeled out whenever necessary and usually sufficiently quieted those on the other side. So for many decades, atheists clutched the notion of infinite time to themselves in the way that Linus clutched his blanket. It was extremely comforting, especially when other facts arose to challenge their theses. But the eventual consensus about the Big Bang ended this forever, forcing everyone to grow up and face the ugly fact that the past time was finite, that the past time was finite. In fact, we came to know precisely how finite. So whatever one proposed as happening randomly over great periods of time, whether the emergence of life from non-life or the evolution from amphibians to orangutans, needed to happen within that limited time frame. Everything that happened needed to happen within a limited time frame. But the second problem some had with the Big Bang was that it came across like a large sign that read, "Science not admitted." It was where time and space and science did not exist. But the idea that we could go back in time to this literal point of infinite density and infinite temperature out of which time and space in our universe had been born seemed absurd. As Robert Frost said, something there is that does not love a wall, and for scientists, the singularity from which the universe emerged in the Big Bang was precisely that. Dennis Overby writes that a singularity could be a cosmic dead end where particles and energy simply went out of existence, a free fire zone where anything permitted was possible. Overby also tells us that Einstein himself reluctantly admitted that singularities were mathematically possible, but thought they were nonsense as far as the real world was concerned. After all, a real physical object could never be squeezed down to a point, could it? As it happens, it could. Nonetheless, when we live in this physical universe, think about singularities, we cannot help but be hornswoggled. Perhaps this is because thinking about the Big Bang makes us wonder if there might be other singularities. The idea of that singularity, even if it existed safely back 13.8 billion years in the past, made a hash of all science. If we know the laws of physics do not exist independently of the universe forever, they can cease to exist anywhere and any time, at least theoretically. This idea put science on a leash, and some scientists didn't like that at all, as it defied their sometimes deified versions of themselves as the ultimate arbiters of truth and knowledge, as the priests of the new religion that was beyond religion. So it could be humbling and embarrassing. What is the opposite of a bang? As the 20th century wore on, some physicists actually did postulate the existence of other singularities, and eventually realized that they already existed, and in great numbers deep in outer space. This began in 1939, 3 decades before anyone saw where it would lead. J. Robert Oppenheimer He's on the left in the picture below, and he's pictured with General Leslie R. Groves. So Oppenheimer, the future head of the Manhattan Project, which brought the atomic bomb into existence, and his grad student Hartland Snyder proposed what they thought was an intriguing idea. Oppenheimer and Snyder thought it would be diverting and valuable to calculate what might happen when a star like our own sun ran out of fuel, which of course would happen eventually. Billions of years into the future, the mass gravity of our sun would cause it to be crushed all the way down to the size of Earth. Since 1 million Earths could fit into the gigantic gas ball that is our sun, the idea of the sun shrinking to our relatively tiny terrestrial size was an arresting concept. But surely it would happen. It would have had the same mass as the sun has now, but it would be 1 million times denser. So while it is now a gigantic flaming ball of gas, Oppenheimer and Snyder calculated that it would at that future point be as dense as iron. This was just where the physics led. Oppenheimer and Snyder were ahead of their time, but they were not alone in trying to work these things out. Others were calculating along similar lines. For example, what if a star, much larger and heavier than our sun, of which there are billions, were to undergo a similar shrinking? And why shouldn't it? It certainly would, as others already had. The larger star's greater mass and much more powerful gravity would make it end up far smaller than our Earth. A much bigger star would be crushed all the way down to the difficult-to-conceive diameter of 10 miles. Overby explains that under this unfathomable pressure, its very atoms would be crushed so that only a mass of neutrons remained. Physicists, figuring these things out, realized they had entered a new reality. Where could it lead? And while they were on the subject, what would happen to the largest stars in the universe? Some have diameters 4 times larger than the sun. What would happen when they collapse under the inconceivable mass and gravity? Today, we know. Their mass will become so unfathomably concentrated that light itself would be unable to escape. It was the English Nobel laureate mathematical physicist Sir Roger Penrose who explained this in 1965, saying that in the end, these massive stars would indeed lead to the very opposite of what the universe had done at the Big Bang. These monstrous stars would eventually go downward and downward, smaller and smaller, until all physics and all science were crushed out of shape and then into non-existence. They would, in fact, disappear all the way down to a singularity when they would effectively put up an out-to-lunch sign, except that they would never return, having disappeared altogether. They would take themselves to an unknown realm beyond our ability to investigate or understand. They would scientifically be observed to go beyond science, disappearing into themselves, like a fakir making himself vanish, like a snake swallowing its own tail. Here again, apart from the Big Bang, was another case of science leading beyond science. And like the Big Bang, it was undeniable. It was as though science were a leader,
meant to say ladder,
leading to a hole in the sky. But when you followed it up into the hole, the ladder vanished behind you. Poof! No more science. At a conference in New York in 1967, the Princeton physicist John Wheeler gave these inconceivable horrors a name. He called them black holes. Overby ruminates on these singularities. Overby says, what are they? They were at once liberation from the gray law and enforcers of the ultimate unknowable law of laws, tangible evidence of a mystery more powerful than anything we could think of, a truth that would fry your brain and blind you if you saw it, like the face of God waiting there at the end of time. They were magic. The idea that the laws of physics, grace, sober relativity should predict the existence of singularities was astonishing. The singularity theorems to me were like evidence of a miracle, of a magic outside the physics itself. I wanted to know, Overby says, if such miracles were such singular terrible transformations were real. If we couldn't see God, would we at least know God was there, even if sulking in a black hole or at the end of time, end quote. Despite the conclusions of such as Einstein, Friedmann, Lemaitre, and Hubble, many continued to be so irritated by the idea of the Big Bang that they continued to refuse to accept it and spent their careers wriggling away from it, keeping hope alive that they'd be once again able to return to the status quo of a universe without a beginning. Even recently, I've heard reference to the fact that people are still talking about refuting the Big Bang and how it's somehow still false. So this desperate attempt to try to explain away the beginning of the universe continues. And it will continue until the end, because we are desperate to remove God from our influence so that we can not have his presence hanging over us, and we can remove the fear that is in our minds so that we can live however we want and not have to worry about there being repercussions for our actions. This is not how all atheists live, but how many of them do. And they live as though this life is all there is, and therefore nothing is really right or wrong. And not all of them think that way, but many of them do. And so this is why it's advantageous for them to try to remove God, because if they do, then they can help quiet their consciences. Leading for those irritated by the idea of the Big Bang, the expanding universe theory was a fad, and they would show it to be so. They called their idea of a static and eternal universe the steady-state theory. Chief among the proponents of the steady-state theory was Fred Hoyle, who was so disdainful of the idea that the universe had exploded into being that in 1949 he did a BBC interview in which he sneered and described this idea as the Big Bang. But this blown raspberry backfired on Hoyle quite badly, and anyone referencing the unpalatable theory from that day forward referred to it as the Big Bang, thereby taping this phrase like some everlasting kick-me sign to poor Hoyle's back. So that's interesting that apparently a non-believer came up with the term, the Big Bang, that believers use to talk about evidence for the beginning of the universe, therefore pointing to the existence of a great beginner, that being God. By the mid-60s, however, all wiggle room on this issue would vanish. The end of the controversy began when a Princeton physicist named Bob Dicke got to thinking that perhaps there was actual evidence of the Big Bang that could be discovered and shown as incontrovertible proof that it happened. He knew that extremely early on, very soon after the Big Bang itself, the universe had began as an expanding fireball of inconceivable heat. So the question was, to where had all the heat escaped? Of course it had dissipated, but it could only have dissipated as far as the universe extended, which the Big Bang model said was certainly not forever. If our universe really were an infinite closed system, all that heat would still be around and trapped. And if it had dissipated evenly, it should be measurable even if the level of heat was now exceedingly small. Dicke calculated that the very early universe must have been about 1 billion degrees, which would have produced high-energy gamma rays. If that were true, these gamma rays would still exist all these billions of years later, probably now as radio waves. It stood to reason. But could they be detected? Could that heat from the Big Bang fireball, now literally scattered across the entire universe, somehow be measured? If those billion degrees of heat were once contained in a universe that was extremely small, but were now scattered throughout the impossibly large universe, they wouldn't be much, but they wouldn't be nothing. Could we find them? Dicke spoke about the possibility of detecting this remaining background radiation to 2 of his graduate students who promptly built an apparatus to do just that. But rather bizarrely, just a few miles away at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey, another pair of radio astronomers had already detected what Dicke's graduate students were looking for, only they didn't know it. Their names were Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, and all they knew was that there was always an annoying, mysterious hiss coming from the radio antenna they were calibrating for their own research. They desperately wanted to get rid of it, and were having conniptions trying to discover its source. It was present every minute, both day and night, and was absolutely everywhere they pointed their antenna. Other folks at Bell Labs had been having this same hissing problem for years. It was a gremlin in the system they had learned to ignore. But for the work these two young men were doing, it had to be eliminated. So first they completely, Penzias and Wilson, disassembled and reassembled the electronics of their antenna, but the hissing was still there. Could it be pigeons? They shoveled away the pigeon droppings that had aggregated on their equipment and shooed away the birds, but the hissing remained. Then they taped over some loose rivets that might be causing the problem, but the infernal hissing kept on hissing. There was no getting rid of the hissing. These two young men eventually read the paper postulating the existence of the background radiation and realized that what they were trying to get rid of was that background radiation, exactly what Dicke's grad students were looking for. They knew it was coming from beyond our galaxy, but not from any particular source, because it was coming from everywhere, literally. It was those billion degrees of heat dissipated over 13.8 billion years, so that it now measured just 2.7 degrees Kelvin. And since Penzias and Wilson hadn't been able to get rid of it and never would be, they were happily able to parlay their discovery into a Nobel Prize. Because they had done it. They had discovered actual proof of the Big Bang. After this, anyone clinging to the idea that the universe had no beginning was instantly transformed into a dinosaur. I guess if you hear the objection that anybody says the Big Bang never really happened, I guess you should refer them to this portion of the book, or specifically Penzias and Wilson. There was no way around it, no going back. The Big Bang happened. The subject and the universe was closed. Once the consensus had shifted, those who couldn't believe the universe had a beginning found it virtually impossible to explain themselves, and most, except for Fred Hoyle, ceased trying. But the picture would get worse still. In the 1990s, NASA's COBE satellite detected this microwave background radiation with such extraordinary precision that we were finally able to see that the explosion from the Big Bang was not perfectly uniform, but contained just enough lumpiness, for lack of a better word, to create aggregates of matter in the form of stars and planets and other objects in outer space. It was a stunning confirmation not merely of the background radiation, but excuse me, but of how exactly we could understand it in the early universe after the Big Bang. The work was sufficient to get the team who worked on it, George Smoot and John Mather, below, their own Nobel Prize. And after that, any chumps still holding a torch for Miss Steady State Universe generally kept it to themselves. So the strange story is that physics eventually proved that the laws of physics had not always existed, nor had the universe in which they manifested themselves. Eventually, there really was a point, literally, beyond which science could not go. For materialists, for whom science was everything, it seemed a cruel and quirky betrayal. Science and the universe science existed to measure and observe could themselves be observed at that curious and mystifying point 13.8 billion years ago to disappear at the beginning of time and space in the beginning. As for Allan Sandage, he was never tempted toward materialism and its scientific constrictions. He was open to whatever was true, to wherever the facts led, even if it was beyond his scientific system, which is to say he was a true scientist, unafraid of following where science might lead, even if that was beyond itself. So, in other words, a true scientist, Metaxas says, a true scientist is willing to follow the facts wherever they go, even if the conclusion makes one uncomfortable. I think the contention on the part of many theists, not even necessarily Christians, but theists, is that because of scientism, many atheistic scientists, materialistic scientists, treat their science a lot like a religion, and their doing that makes them unable to follow facts outside of their preconceived scientific system. If there were truths beyond this telescope's reach, what of it? But what had become the biggest question for Sandage was not whether the universe had begun with a bang. He knew that it had, and he knew exactly where it had come from. It came from nowhere, and he knew that it had gotten here, which was somewhere, from there, which was not. The question for him now was simply, where was it going? Now that it had expanded from nothing to what it is presently, would it keep expanding forever into the infinite forever? Or into the infinite future? Into the infinite future. Or would it, at some future moment, cease expanding and then fall backward into itself, like a ball that is thrown high by but eventually slows to an instant of stasis where gravity overtakes its upward momentum and then falls back down the way it came, decreasing in size and eventually collapsing into the greatest black hole imaginable. And if that, then what? Sandage wasn't sure what he'd find, but he had no dog in the fight, so to speak. He was simply scientifically curious and fascinated to know what could be known. But he sensed God in the details of it all, just as he did in other marvels. In a conversation in the mid-70s, Sandage said, quote, to think the universe happened only once. That makes it even more mysterious in a sense. What happened before the first microsecond is outside the realm of science, but it is no more mysterious than noting the tremendous complexity of the comical balance of the human body. You cut yourself, and why is it that the white corpuscles know exactly where to go to close the wound? That's a miracle. And I don't believe that's due to progressive selection of the fittest. It's just to find a mechanism. This is a scientist, Allan Sandage. I don't know what I'm saying now. I don't know what the next sentence is. I don't mean that points to the existence of God, whatever that means. Newton's laws are God, in a sense. But I find it all so rational and so amazingly beautiful and so mysterious, end quote by Sandage. Overby's book makes clear that Sandage was one of those rare figures, self-confident enough to be open-minded, not to cling to any preconceived notions concerning the nature of reality or even the limits of science. He was what we must call a genuine free thinker, with enough stature in the scientific community not to fear what others might think. Overby says Sandage thought about these things without worrying about whether his thoughts were scientific or philosophical or theological. He was a scientist unconstrained by the restrictions of what had to become a kind of scientific dogma, although that dogma was not all that scientific, but was rather simply philosophical bias. Yes, and that is what you have today in modern 21st century science. The majority does not, despite what they say, the majority does not want to follow science where it leads, but they rather follow that scientific dogma that Metaxas refers to, that really is just philosophical bias that seeks to eradicate God's influence from everything. They want to try to explain things naturally, and they keep making empty promises of just give it more time and science will come up with the answer. Well, no, because science keeps changing its mind, because there are many things that are not going to be able to be figured out by science, that are not going to be able to be explained from a materialistic point of view. Sandage felt that the world was too magical to be an accident, although in his milder moment he admitted that he didn't know enough about evolution to be shooting his mouth off. Actually, he did, but he was too humble to provoke those on the other side of this divide, and not willing to spend much time arguing about it either. He had other fish to fry, but he couldn't stop his mind, and sometimes his mouth, from going whither it listed. That was the joy of thinking, wasn't it? And wasn't that connected to the deepest ideas of science and life? Why should anyone constrict that? Overby remembers a lunch in 1975 when Sandage was ruminating on the possibility of God. A nearby couple asked if they might join the conversation. The man was a minister and thought Sandage must be too. Sandage was thrilled. 2 years later, Sandage said of himself, quote, I don't know what I would call myself. If you believe anything of the hard science of cosmology, there was an event that happened that can be age-dated back in the past. Just the very fact of science can make that statement, that cosmology can understand the universe at a much earlier state, and it did emerge from a state that was fundamentally different. Now that's an act of creation. From the realm of science, one cannot say any more detail about that creation than the first book of Genesis, end quote. Clearly, Sandage's mind was groping its way forward at that time. Quote, I think that the whole rationality of the universe is a mystery, end quote, Sandage said. Or, quote, the fact that Newton's and Einstein's equations work is one of the world's greatest mysteries. And in that sense, I'm very religious, end quote. But around 1980, Sandage seems to have been sufficiently persuaded by what he understood to become a Christian. Okay, so around 1980, Sandage became a Christian, though not quite publicly. But Sandage was obviously fed up with the academic posturing and with the affectation that had become common in his field, in which scientists drifted beyond the clouds to a vaunted realm in which only they knew what they were saying as they discussed their arcane entre nous theories on the nature of the universe and reality, while seeming to have forgotten the simple childlike questions many scientists had started with in the first place. In conversation with Overby, Sandage mocked some of the trendy theories and terminology in vogue at the time, which to him made no real sense and no real purchase in reality. What is a superstring, Sandage asked, and what is the nature of nothing? Does that statement make any sense, or is it gobbledygook? The nature of nothing. What they say seems to be absolutely nonsense. They say the universe could create itself out of nothing, a self-causing entity, because they say you could do it with zero energy. Well, that's just using words to convince themselves they can earn a living, Sandage says about the materialists. Then, with typical graciousness, he said that statement was unfair. But of course, it certainly wasn't unfair, even slightly. It was a legitimate question, Sandage says. I can talk the same language, but I don't understand the words. And the more I read the journal Nature and these popular books and attend certain conferences, I can talk the language better year by year, but I understand less and less of the thing. It's fascinating, but I don't think it gets down to the nub. I think it's a philosophical leap that can't be made. There's an edge to science beyond which the questions of why are outside the realm of science. He continued in the same vein, asking Overby, do you believe in grand unification theories? Why? Because everyone you respect tells you to. You're seduced by its beauty. And because it's so beautiful, it has to be true. Why do you believe why do you believe that's true any more than the existence of God, which is also a beautiful theory and also explains a great deal? It's a hypothesis that is checkable in its consequences, yet you reject that beautiful hypothesis. As we said earlier, it was the 1985 conference that this grand old man of astronomy and the heir to the great Edwin Hubble would come out of the closet at the rarest of rare creatures, the top scientist in his field who was willing to acknowledge publicly his belief in God. And not merely in God, but in the God of the Bible. That was, so in 1985, that would have been Sandage, who came out as a believer in God. Although Stephen Meyer was then just a young geophysicist working for an oil company, the conference in Sandage so affected Meyer that he was never the same, afterward going to Cambridge to study philosophy and the history of science, and then going on to write numerous books on the very questions Sandage raised that day. Meyer has multiple books that would be pertinent for this channel, such as Return of the God Hypothesis, such as The Signature in the Cell. In Return of the God Hypothesis, Meyer recalls goggling at the scientific luminaries assembled. The philosopher Anthony Flew, then arguably the world's most prominent atheist, was there, as were other atheists and agnostics. I believe it's this book, Is Atheism Dead?, that talks about how near the end of his life, Anthony Flew became a theist. I don't know that he became, I believe it was him. I don't believe Flew, he may not have come all the way to become a Christian, but I think he changed from an atheist to a theist. The philosopher Anthony Flew, then arguably the world's most prominent atheist, was there, as were other atheists and agnostics. Also there were the Harvard astrophysicist Owen Gingerich, who was openly Christian, as was the biophysicist Dean Kenyon. So there are two Christians who are scientists right there. Donald Goldsmith was there, the man who served Carl Sagan as the principal science advisor on the Cosmos TV series, in which a materialistic worldview had been declared and popularized to Western culture. The young Meyer remembers his astonishment at seeing Hubble's error, publicly acknowledging that his science had carried him beyond the atheism and agnosticism of many of his peers. Meyer also recalls that in his talk on the Big Bang, Sandage shocked many of his colleagues by announcing a recent religious conversion, then explaining how the scientific evidence of a creation event had contributed to a profound change in his worldview. So again, these people who are these scientists who are coming out saying that the Big Bang didn't really happen. Excuse me. I really think that their philosophy of there can't be a God, I think their philosophy is driving them to reach for anything that they can grab onto that can possibly make it, they can manipulate into making it look like, seem like, sound like the Big Bang didn't really happen. Then they can convince people who don't know any better, who will follow them wherever they lead and believe anything they say. And people will be more accustomed, will be more open to following these materialistic scientists, because the opposite would be to acknowledge that God exists. And if there is a God, that means there is objective morality, and that there is one, capital O, to whom we are ultimately responsible. But many of these materialists don't want that to be the case, because they want to be able to live however they want. They don't want to be told how to live and how not to live. Meyer remembers that Sandage looked at the audience intensely as he spoke. What has happened in the last 50 years, Sandage said, is a remarkable event within astronomy and astrophysics. By looking up at the sky, some astronomers have come to the belief that there is evidence for a creation event. Meyer was impressed with Sandage's candor and took furious notes of what he said, including the following, quote, I now have to go from a stance that as a complete materialistic rational scientist and say this supernatural event to me gives at least some credence to my belief that there is some design put in the universe. I'm convinced that there is some order in the universe. I think all scientists at the deepest level are so startled by what they see in the miraculousness of their interconnection of things in their field that they at least have wondered why it is this way, end quote. Sandage was careful to say that there were still questions, and that of course science could not prove God, but he hardly shrank from the clear implications of what science had learned from the skies, and was quite willing to side with the God whose handiwork he saw in them and perhaps had seen with greater intensity. I think that God has created a universe such that science can be a great ally in the world. Science can show us just how great God is, how organized he has created things, such that he created a universe that is able to be discovered to a large degree. That many of the things that we are discovering through the great field of science is many of these discoveries are made possible because we live in a theistic universe in which science is made possible because he made it possible for us to do science. Sandage was careful to say that there were still questions, and that of course science could not prove God, but he hardly shrank from the clear implications of what science had learned from the skies, and was quite willing to side with the God whose handiwork he saw in them, and perhaps had seen with greater intensity and magnification than anyone in the world. Robert Jastrow of the Goddard Institute was on the stage that day too, and although an agnostic Jew, Jastrow did not lean away from the clear implications of what he was watching. Yes, I believe there's also a chapter at the end of I Don't Have Enough Faith. There's a chapter in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, in which Frank Turek and Norm Geisler quote this famous Jastrow quote as well, which I believe is going to be forthcoming momentarily. So, Jastrow was of the Goddard Institute was on the stage that day too, and although an agnostic Jew, he did not lean away from the clear implications of what he was watching. Yes. In the famous conclusion to Jastrow's book, God and the Astronomers, Jastrow puts it memorably well, so much so that what he said may serve as a fitting end to our discussion. The discovery of a definite cosmic beginning, Jastrow says, quote, is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. They, the theologians, have always accepted the word of the Bible in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. It is unexpected because science has had such extraordinary success in trying the chain of cause and effect backward in time. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. Look at that. The materialistic scientist is completely reliant on his own reason because there's nothing beyond himself. So for him, Jastrow, the agnostic, says, I believe somewhere, it might be, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, I believe it says there that Jastrow is an agnostic. So Jastrow says, for the scientist who's lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. He pulls himself over the final rock, and he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries, end quote. What Jastrow, I think, is saying is that the theologians believe that God exists, and they, because God is helping them acquire this knowledge about the universe, many of the things that the scriptures teach, the Bible teaches, are consistent with what science has discovered. And, for instance, the expanding universe. And so the scientist climbs by his faith in the power of reason. He gets to the top of the mountain of ignorance, and there are a bunch of theologians waiting for him who've been sitting there for centuries. So that's the end of chapter 2 in Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Chapter 3 will begin a look at the fine-tuning. He's got multiple fine-tuning chapters. The next one, chapter 3, is on the fine-tuned planet. So thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing the published work, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist, where we go through the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.